morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform for the third time. At 24, she was one of the youngest sergeants in the company, but her confidence had been shattered months ago during a mission that left her with scars covering her left arm and shoulder. The raised, twisted skin told a story of courage under fire, but to Sarah they felt like marks of shame. The other soldiers were already forming ranks when she approached. Private Johnson, a burly man with a permanent sneer, noticed her first. He elbowed his buddy Private Davis and whispered something that made both men chuckle. Sarah pretended not to notice, but her stomach tightened with familiar dread. "Attention!" shouted Sergeant Brooks, and the troops snapped to formation. Sarah took her position, trying to keep her scarred arm positioned away from the others. The morning briefing began with updates about upcoming training exercises and equipment inspections. Everything seemed normal, until Colonel Peterson announced that General Harrison would be visiting their base next week for a special inspection. The news sent a buzz of nervous energy through the ranks. General Harrison was a legend in the military, known for his sharp eye and no-nonsense approach to leadership. After the briefing, as the soldiers dispersed to their duties, Johnson and his group lingered near Sarah. "Hey, Martinez," Johnson called out loudly enough for others to hear. "You better keep those arms covered when the general comes. Wouldn't want him to lose his appetite seeing all that mess." Davis joined in, making exaggerated gestures of disgust. "Yeah, looks like someone tried to iron your skin with a hot griddle." The small group erupted in cruel laughter, and Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation. She tried to walk away, but Johnson stepped in front of her. "What's wrong, Scarface? Can't take a little joke?" His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing attention from other soldiers who stopped to watch the spectacle. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Move aside, Johnson," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. "Or what?" Johnson taunted. "You'll cry to the commanding officer? Tell them the mean soldiers are making fun of your battle wounds?" He air-quoted the last words mockingly. The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some soldiers looked uncomfortable, but none stepped forward to intervene. Sarah realized that this moment would define how she was treated for the rest of her time at this base. Instead of backing down, she stood straighter and looked Johnson directly in the eyes. "These scars came from pulling 3 wounded soldiers out of a burning vehicle in Afghanistan," she said clearly. "While you were safe in your bunk, I was saving lives." Johnson's face reddened with anger at being challenged publicly. "Oh, so now you're a hero? Funny how heroes always seem to get themselves blown up. Maybe if you were better at your job, you wouldn't look like a walking reminder of failure." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she refused to show weakness. Unknown to everyone present, a figure in pressed dress uniform had been walking past the nearby building and had stopped at the sound of raised voices. General Harrison had arrived at the base earlier than expected, wanting to get an unannounced feel for the unit's daily operations. He stood in the shadow of the building, close enough to hear every word but hidden from view. His weathered face darkened as he listened to the verbal assault on the young sergeant. The general's own body bore similar scars from his early days in combat, and he recognized the pain behind Sarah's composed exterior. Sarah finally managed to push past Johnson and his group, walking quickly toward the barracks. Behind her, she could hear continued laughter and crude comments about her appearance. Each word felt like salt in an open wound, but she held her head high until she was out of sight. In her small quarters, Sarah sat on her narrow bed and stared at her reflection in the mirror mounted on the wall. The scars were clearly visible where her short-sleeved shirt revealed them. They started at her shoulder and snaked down her arm, in an angry pattern of raised skin that would never fully fade. She remembered the day she got them with crystal clarity. The roadside bomb had flipped their convoy vehicle, trapping her squad inside as flames engulfed the wreckage. Without thinking, she had crawled back into the burning metal tomb 3 times to drag out her wounded comrades. The last trip had cost her dearly when a piece of superheated metal fell across her arm and shoulder. The doctors had told her she was lucky to keep full use of her arm. Her commanding officer had recommended her for a Bronze Star for valor. But all Sarah could see now were the ugly reminders of that day, made worse by the constant ridicule from soldiers who had never faced real combat. She pulled on a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm weather, knowing it would be uncomfortable during training but preferring the discomfort to the stares and comments. As she prepared for the afternoon exercises, Sarah made a silent promise to herself that she would request a transfer after the general's visit. She couldn't endure much more of this treatment. Outside her window, she could see Johnson and his friends still gathered in the courtyard, probably planning new ways to torment her. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had once driven her to run into burning vehicles to save others. That woman seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who just wanted to hide from the world. The afternoon training session would be another test of her resolve, another opportunity for public humiliation. Sarah straightened her shoulders and headed for the door, unaware that her ordeal had been witnessed by someone with the power to change everything. The afternoon training session was held in the sweltering heat of the base's obstacle course. Sarah had changed into her long-sleeved combat uniform, despite knowing it would make the physical challenges even more difficult. Sweat was already beading on her forehead as she joined the other soldiers at the starting line. Sergeant Brooks outlined the day's exercise, a timed run through the obstacle course followed by weapons training at the range. Sarah had always excelled at these activities before her injury, but now she struggled with the psychological weight of constant scrutiny and mockery. "Martinez," Johnson shouted from across the group. "Hope you don't overheat in that winter gear. Or are you hiding something under there?" His comment drew snickers from several nearby soldiers. Private Chen, a quiet soldier who rarely spoke up, glanced at Sarah with sympathetic eyes but said nothing. Like many others, he seemed torn between doing what was right and avoiding becoming Johnson's next target. As the whistle blew and the soldiers began their run, Sarah found herself falling behind. The heavy fabric of her long sleeves restricted her movement and trapped heat against her body. Each obstacle became a struggle not just against the physical challenge, but against the internal voice telling her she was weak and damaged. At the rope climb, her covered arms made gripping difficult. Johnson, who had finished well ahead of the group, stood at the bottom shouting mock encouragement. "Come on, Scarface. Maybe if you take off that jacket, you'll move faster. Oh wait, then we'd have to look at that train wreck you call skin." Several soldiers laughed, but Sarah noticed that more of them looked uncomfortable now. The constant bullying was beginning to wear on everyone, not just her. Still, no one spoke up to defend her. She completed the rope climb, her arms shaking with exhaustion and overheating. As she moved to the next obstacle, Sarah stumbled slightly, her vision blurring from heat exhaustion. Davis, emboldened by Johnson's behavior, decided to join in the harassment. "Maybe you should sit this one out, Martinez," Davis called loudly. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself worse than you already are. Some people just aren't cut out for military life after they get broken." The word broken hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was her deepest fear made public, that her injuries had fundamentally changed her, that she was no longer the capable soldier she once was. She stopped at the next obstacle, a wall climb that required upper body strength and coordination. Unknown to the training group, General Harrison had positioned himself at a vantage point where he could observe the exercise without being seen. He had spent the morning reviewing personnel files and had been particularly interested in Sarah's record. Her service history was exemplary, marked by commendations for bravery and leadership. The contrast between her documented excellence and what he was witnessing now troubled him deeply. The general watched as Sarah attempted the wall climb 3 times, each effort weaker than the last. Her long sleeves were now soaked with sweat, and she was clearly struggling with heat exhaustion. What angered him most was not her difficulty with the obstacle, but the continued verbal abuse from Johnson and his followers. "Give it up, Martinez," Johnson yelled. "You're embarrassing yourself and the whole unit. Maybe they should transfer you to a desk job where you can't hurt anyone else." This comment seemed to break something inside Sarah. She stepped away from the wall, her hands shaking not just from exertion but from emotional pain. For a moment it looked like she might collapse or run from the field entirely. But then something shifted in her expression. Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Johnson. "You want to see what's under these sleeves so badly?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. "Fine." Before anyone could react, Sarah began rolling up her left sleeve. The fabric stuck to her sweaty skin and she had to peel it away carefully. As more of her arm was revealed, the joking and laughter gradually died away. The scars were extensive and dramatic. Raised, twisted skin formed patterns across her shoulder and upper arm, where the burning metal had seared through her uniform. The marks were clearly from severe burns, the kind that spoke of incredible pain and a long, difficult recovery. Johnson's mouth hung open, his cruel words dying in his throat. The entire training group had gone silent, staring at the visible evidence of trauma that Sarah had been hiding. Some soldiers looked away, uncomfortable with their own participation in the bullying. "This is what pulling 3 soldiers out of a burning vehicle looks like," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "These scars saved the lives of Corporal Williams, Private First Class Rodriguez, and Specialist Thompson. They were unconscious and trapped when our convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar." She turned her arm so everyone could see the full extent of the scarring. "I went back into that burning wreck 3 times because I wasn't going to leave my people behind. The 3rd time, part of the roof collapsed and pinned a piece of superheated metal against my arm for almost 30 seconds before I could get free." The silence stretched across the training ground like a held breath. Even Johnson seemed to realize he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Several soldiers, including Chen, took steps closer to Sarah in a gesture of support. "Those 3 soldiers went home to their families because of these scars," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "If that makes me broken or disgusting in your eyes, then I'll wear that judgment with pride." General Harrison stepped out from his observation point, his face grim with purpose. He had seen enough to understand the true character of this young sergeant and the toxic environment she was enduring. As he strode across the training ground toward the group, his presence commanded immediate attention. "Attention!" someone shouted, and every soldier snapped to rigid attention, their eyes forward. Sarah quickly tried to roll her sleeve back down, but the general held up a hand to stop her. "As you were, Sergeant Martinez," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "Keep that sleeve exactly where it is." General Harrison's presence transformed the training ground. The man was a living legend, with silver hair and steel-gray eyes that had seen decades of combat. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his bearing unmistakably that of a warrior who had earned every star on his collar through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication to his soldiers. "Sergeant Martinez," the general said, approaching her with measured steps. "I understand you were involved in the convoy incident outside Kandahar 18 months ago." Sarah's throat felt dry as sand. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, still holding her scarred arm exposed as he had commanded. The general stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the small scars on his own hands and face, marks that spoke of his own combat experience. "Tell me about that day, Sergeant. I want to hear it from you." Johnson and his group looked terrified, suddenly realizing that their bullying had been witnessed by the highest-ranking officer on the base. Sweat that had nothing to do with the heat began forming on Johnson's forehead as he maintained his rigid attention posture. Sarah took a shaky breath. "Sir, our convoy was traveling back to base after a supply run when we hit an improvised explosive device. The blast flipped our lead vehicle and ruptured the fuel tank. The vehicle caught fire immediately with 3 soldiers trapped inside." "Continue," the general said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I was in the 2nd vehicle, sir. When I saw what happened, I ran to help. Corporal Williams was unconscious near the rear door. I was able to pull him clear, but the fire was spreading fast. Private Rodriguez was trapped under debris in the middle seat, and Specialist Thompson was pinned near the driver's position." Sarah's voice grew steadier as she recounted the events, the memory sharp despite the time that had passed. "I went back in for Rodriguez, sir. Had to move burning debris to free him. Got him out, but I could see Thompson was still trapped in the front." General Harrison nodded slowly. "And the 3rd time?" "The roof was starting to buckle, sir. The whole vehicle was becoming unstable. But Thompson was still alive. I could hear him calling for help. So I went back in." Sarah paused, her eyes focused on something beyond the training ground. "Part of the roof collapsed while I was pulling him free. A piece of superheated metal from the engine compartment fell across my arm and shoulder." "How long were you pinned?" the general asked quietly. "Maybe 30 seconds, sir. Felt like forever. But I got Thompson out. All 3 soldiers made full recoveries." The general stepped back and surveyed the assembled troops, his gaze settling on Johnson and his group. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of equipment being moved elsewhere on the base. "I've read the after-action reports," General Harrison said, his voice carrying across the training ground. Sergeant Martinez's actions that day were nothing short of heroic. She risked her life 3 times to save her fellow soldiers, sustaining severe injuries in the process. He began walking slowly among the troops, making eye contact with each soldier. What I witnessed here today, however, was a different kind of action. I saw soldiers mocking and ridiculing someone who exemplifies the very best of military service. Johnson's face had gone pale, and Davis looked like he might be sick. The other soldiers stood frozen, knowing they were witnessing a reckoning that would define their unit for years to come. "Private Johnson," the general said, stopping directly in front of the man who had led the harassment. "Step forward." Johnson broke from formation and stood at attention before the general, his hands visibly shaking. "Sir, I heard you refer to Sergeant Martinez as Scarface and suggest that her injuries made her unfit for military service. Is that an accurate characterization of your words?" "Sir, Johnson's voice cracked. "Sir, yes, sir." "And you, Private Davis," the general continued, his gaze shifting to the other main tormentor. "You compared her scars to being ironed with a hot griddle. Do you stand by that description?" Davis stepped forward, sweat now pouring down his face. "Sir, you didn't mean what, Private?" The general's voice could have cut steel. "You didn't mean to publicly humiliate a decorated war hero? You didn't mean to create a hostile environment for someone who nearly died saving her comrades." The 2 men stood silent, having no acceptable answer for their behavior. General Harrison turned back to address the entire group. "Let me tell you something about scars, soldiers. Every real warrior carries them, whether they're visible or not. They're proof that we've stood in harm's way for something greater than ourselves." He began rolling up his own sleeve, revealing an arm marked with shrapnel scars and surgical marks. "I got these in Vietnam, pulling my wounded radio operator out of a rice paddy while under enemy fire. They're not pretty, but they remind me every day why we serve." The impact of the general's revelation rippled through the assembled troops. Here was a man they all revered, showing that he too bore the marks of sacrifice. "Sergeant Martinez," the general said, turning back to her, "how many lives have you saved in your military career?" Sarah looked confused by the question. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." "The 3 soldiers from the convoy incident. Any others?" "Well, sir, there was a medical emergency during basic training where I performed CPR on a recruit who had collapsed. And during our deployment, I provided first aid to several civilian casualties during humanitarian missions. So at least 6 lives," the general said, his voice carrying a note of pride. 6 people who are alive today because of your actions and your willingness to put others before yourself." He addressed the group again. "This is what a real soldier looks like, troops. Someone who bears the physical and emotional scars of service with dignity, who continues to serve despite having already paid a higher price than most of us will ever be asked to pay." The general's words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing every soldier present to examine their own behavior and their understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. Johnson and Davis looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. Around them, other soldiers began to shift uncomfortably, realizing their own complicity in the harassment through their silence and inaction. General Harrison's expression hardened as he surveyed the assembled troops. The silence stretched uncomfortably as every soldier waited to see what consequences would follow their behavior. Sarah remained at attention, her scarred arm still exposed, feeling more vulnerable than she had since the day of her injury. "Private Johnson." "Private Davis," the general said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You will report to my office at 600 hours tomorrow morning. We're going to have a very long conversation about what it means to serve with honor." Both men snapped to attention. "Yes, sir," they responded in unison, though their voices betrayed their terror. "Furthermore," the general continued, "you will spend the next month on extra duty, beginning with cleaning the medical ward at the base hospital. Perhaps spending time around wounded veterans will help you develop some perspective on the meaning of sacrifice." The punishment sent a clear message to everyone present. Johnson and Davis had crossed a line that the military's highest leadership would not tolerate. "As for the rest of you," General Harrison said, addressing the larger group, "I'm disappointed in what I've witnessed here. A unit is only as strong as its weakest member, and today you've all shown weakness, not in physical ability but in character." Private Chen stepped forward slightly, breaking formation. "Sir, permission to speak?" The general nodded. "Granted. Sir, some of us wanted to say something, but we didn't know how. We were wrong to stay silent. You're right, Private Chen. Silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit, but recognizing that is the first step toward becoming better soldiers and better people. General Harrison then did something unexpected. He approached Sarah and gently touched her scarred arm, tracing one of the marks with a respectful finger. These scars tell a story of courage, Sergeant Martinez. They're not something to hide. They're something to wear with pride. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but they were different from the tears of humiliation she had been fighting earlier. These came from a place of validation and recognition that she hadn't felt since her injury. Sir, Sarah said quietly, sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice going back into that vehicle the third time. The doctor said I was lucky to keep full use of my arm. Sergeant, the general replied, his voice gentle but firm. Let me tell you about Specialist Thompson. After his recovery, he went on to complete his tour and returned home to his wife and newborn daughter. That little girl is now walking and calling him Daddy, because you chose to go back for him. Do you think that was the wrong choice? Sarah's composure finally broke and tears rolled down her cheeks. No, sir. It wasn't wrong. These scars are your Medal of Honor, Sergeant. They're proof that when the moment came to choose between your own safety and the lives of your brothers in arms, you chose them. Every real soldier in this unit should look at you with respect and admiration. The general turned back to address the group, his voice rising with authority. From this moment forward, Sergeant Martinez will be treated with the respect she has earned through her service and sacrifice. Anyone who has a problem with that will answer directly to me. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Moreover, I'm implementing immediate changes to this unit. Sergeant Martinez, you're being promoted to Staff Sergeant effective immediately. You'll also be taking over training responsibilities for new recruits, because I want them to learn what real leadership looks like. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled soldiers. A promotion in the field by a general was almost unheard of, marking Sarah as someone destined for significant leadership roles. Additionally, General Harrison continued, this unit will undergo mandatory training on military values and the treatment of wounded veterans. We're going to remember what we're fighting for and who we're supposed to be. Johnson looked like he might faint. His actions hadn't just earned him punishment, they had triggered a complete restructuring of their unit's culture and leadership. Private Chen stepped forward again. Sir, what can we do to make this right? The general considered the question carefully. You can start by apologizing to Staff Sergeant Martinez. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because it's the right thing to do. Then you can prove through your actions that you understand what it means to serve with honor. One by one, the soldiers began stepping forward. Chen was first, removing his helmet and looking Sarah directly in the eyes. Staff Sergeant Martinez, I'm sorry for my silence. I should have stood up for you, and I failed. It won't happen again. Other soldiers followed, each offering their own apology. Some were clearly uncomfortable, but most seemed genuinely remorseful for their behavior or inaction. Sarah accepted each apology with grace, understanding that real change would have to be proven through future actions. When it came time for Johnson and Davis to apologize, their words were stilted and clearly motivated by fear rather than genuine remorse. But General Harrison allowed them to speak, knowing that sometimes the first step toward real change was simply acknowledging wrongdoing, even if the motivation wasn't pure. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the general said when the apologies were complete, I want you to know that your service record speaks for itself. You've been recommended for transfer to Officer Candidate School. If you're interested, I can make that happen. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Becoming an officer had been a dream she thought was lost after her injury. Sir, I would be honored. Good. We need leaders who understand what real sacrifice looks like. Your scars don't disqualify you from leadership. They prove you're ready for it. As the formal gathering began to break up, General Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. Staff Sergeant, I want you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't about your scars or your appearance. It was about fear. Fear, sir. Johnson and the others were afraid of what your scars represented. The reality that military service involves real risks and real sacrifices. It was easier for them to mock you than to confront their own fear of being wounded or tested in combat. Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to understand the psychology behind the harassment she had endured. Your scars remind them that this isn't a game, the general continued. that real soldiers sometimes pay real prices for their service. Instead of respecting that sacrifice, they tried to diminish it to make themselves feel safer. The insight was illuminating for Sarah, helping her understand that the cruelty she had faced was more about her tormentors' insecurities than any real failing on her part. 3 weeks after General Harrison's intervention, the transformation of the unit was remarkable. Sarah, now Staff Sergeant Martinez, stood before a group of new recruits in the training facility, her sleeves rolled up to reveal her scars without shame. The marks that had once made her feel broken now served as powerful teaching tools. Leadership isn't about being perfect, she told the young soldiers gathered around her. It's about making the right choice when everything is falling apart around you. Sometimes that choice leaves marks, but those marks become part of who you are. The recruits listened with rapt attention. Word had spread throughout the base about the sergeant who had saved 3 lives and the general who had publicly honored her sacrifice. Sarah had become something of a legend, though she still struggled to see herself that way. Private Chen, who had been among the first to apologize, had requested to join Sarah's training unit. He now served as her assistant instructor, helping to create an environment where all soldiers felt valued and respected, regardless of their background or any challenges they faced. Staff Sergeant Martinez, one young recruit, raised her hand. How do you know when you're making the right choice in a dangerous situation? Sarah considered the question carefully. You don't always know, she answered honestly. When I went back into that burning vehicle for the 3rd time, I wasn't thinking about being brave or heroic. I was thinking about Specialist Thompson and how his wife would feel if I didn't try everything possible to bring him home. She gestured to her scars. These remind me every day that sometimes doing the right thing costs you something. But the alternative, living with the knowledge that you could have saved someone and chose not to try, that would have been a much worse wound. The training session continued with practical exercises, but the atmosphere was completely different from the toxic environment that had existed before. Soldiers supported each other, and anyone struggling with a task received help rather than ridicule. Johnson and Davis had completed their month of extra duty at the medical ward, an experience that had profoundly changed both men. Spending time with wounded veterans had forced them to confront the reality of military sacrifice in a way that abstract knowledge never could. Johnson, in particular, had been shaken by meeting a Marine who had lost both legs in an IED explosion, but maintained a positive attitude and continued to serve in an administrative role. The man's courage and resilience had made Johnson realize how shallow and cruel his treatment of Sarah had been. Both men had requested to meet with Sarah privately to offer more sincere apologies. The conversations had been awkward but seemed genuine, and Sarah had accepted their remorse while making it clear that their future actions would determine whether forgiveness was truly warranted. General Harrison had made good on his promise to recommend Sarah for officer candidate school. The paperwork was being processed, and she was scheduled to begin the program in 6 months. It was an opportunity that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days of being harassed and ridiculed. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. She had begun wearing short-sleeved uniforms again, no longer trying to hide her scars. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had taken weeks of encouragement from fellow soldiers and daily reminders that her marks were symbols of honor, not shame. One afternoon, while reviewing training reports in her office, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Specialist Thompson, the 3rd soldier she had pulled from the burning vehicle, had driven 6 hours from his new duty station to see her. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he said, standing at attention in her doorway. Permission to enter? Of course, Thompson. Come in and please sit down. Thompson entered and took a seat across from her desk, but seemed nervous and unsure how to begin. Ma'am, I heard about what happened here a few weeks ago. About how some soldiers were treating you. Sarah nodded. News travels fast in the military. Ma'am, I wanted you to know that what you did for me, for all of us that day, it changed my life. Not just because you saved it, but because you showed me what real courage looks like. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. This is my daughter, Emma. She's 8 months old now. Every night when I put her to bed, I think about how she almost never got to meet her daddy. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion as she looked at the picture of a beautiful baby with Thompson's eyes. I named her Emma Sarah Thompson, he continued. Emma after my grandmother, and Sarah after you. I wanted her to carry the name of the woman who made sure she would have a father. The gesture was so unexpected and touching that Sarah had to wipe tears from her eyes. Thompson, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, ma'am. I just wanted you to know that those scars you carry, they mean everything to my family. They're proof that someone cared enough about a stranger to risk everything to save him. After Thompson left, Sarah sat alone in her office thinking about how much her perspective had changed. For months, she had seen her scars as evidence of damage and failure. Now she was beginning to understand them as proof of love. Love for her fellow soldiers that had been strong enough to overcome fear and self-preservation. That evening, she received a call from Corporal Williams, the first soldier she had pulled from the vehicle. He was calling from his home in Texas, where he was now married and working as a firefighter. Sarah, he said, using her first name as he always had. I heard about what happened at your base. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm proud of how you handled it. Thanks, Marcus. It's been a difficult few months. Listen, I want you to know something. After what you did for us, after seeing your courage that day, it changed how I approach my job as a firefighter. Every time I run into a burning building, I think about you going back into that vehicle 3 times. You showed me what it means to put others first. Rodriguez had also called earlier that week, telling her that he had become an EMT and was planning to become a paramedic. All 3 men credited their rescue with inspiring them to careers focused on helping others. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw something different than she had for months. Instead of focusing on the scars, she saw the woman who had earned them. She saw someone who had proven that when the ultimate test came, she had chosen courage over safety, others over self. The reflection looking back at her was no longer someone broken or damaged. It was a leader, a hero, and a woman ready to take on new challenges and greater responsibilities. 2 years later, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the Military Academy's graduation ceremony, her dress uniform crisp and her lieutenant's bars gleaming in the afternoon sun. She had completed officer candidate school at the top of her class and was now preparing to address the newest group of military officers. In the audience sat General Harrison, now retired but still commanding in presence. Next to him were Corporal Williams, Rodriguez, and Specialist Thompson with his wife and young daughter Emma Sarah. Johnson and Davis were also present, having both been transferred to Sarah's unit and become 2 of her most dedicated soldiers after their attitude transformation. Fellow officers, Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. Today marks not just your graduation, but your commitment to serve something greater than yourselves. As you begin your careers, you will face moments that test not just your tactical knowledge, but your character. She paused, looking out at the sea of young faces eager to begin their military careers. Some of those tests will leave marks, not all of them visible. You may face situations where doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. When those moments come, remember that the marks we carry from serving others are not signs of weakness or failure. They are proof of our commitment to the values we swore to uphold. Sarah rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the scars that had once caused her such shame. The marks were still there, still prominent, but they no longer carried the weight of embarrassment or self-doubt. These scars came from a day when I had to choose between my own safety and the lives of 3 fellow soldiers. At the time, it seemed like an easy choice. Looking back, I realize it was the most important decision of my life, not because it made me a hero, but because it taught me what I was truly capable of when everything was on the line. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Many of the new officers had heard versions of her story, but hearing it directly from her made it more powerful. Leadership isn't about being perfect, she continued. It's about being willing to sacrifice for those under your command. It's about making the hard choices when others cannot or will not. And it's about understanding that sometimes the greatest honor comes from the battles that leave us changed. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by General Harrison. The man who had changed her life with his intervention and support looked older but no less dignified. Lieutenant Martinez, he said, extending his hand. Outstanding speech. You've come a long way from that day on the training ground. Thank you, sir, for everything. I don't know where I'd be without your support. General Harrison smiled. You'd be exactly where you are now because you had the strength all along. I just helped you remember it. Thompson approached with his family, his daughter, now a toddler, walking unsteadily between her parents. The little girl looked up at Sarah with curious eyes, unaware that she was meeting the woman whose sacrifice had ensured her father would be there to walk with her. "Emma," Thompson said, kneeling down to his daughter's level. "This is the lady Daddy told you about. Can you say Sarah?" The little girl smiled and reached out toward Sarah's scarred arm, her tiny fingers tracing the raised skin with innocent curiosity. There was no fear or revulsion in her touch, just the pure acceptance of a child who saw only kindness in the woman before her. "Thank you," Thompson's wife said quietly, tears in her eyes, "for giving us our family." Later that evening, Sarah received a letter that had been forwarded from her old base. The return address showed it was from a young soldier she didn't recognize. Inside, she found a heartfelt note from a private who had heard her story and wanted her to know how it had inspired him to stay in the military despite facing his own challenges with a disability. The letter reminded Sarah that her story had reached far beyond the people directly involved. It had become part of the larger narrative about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. As she prepared for her new assignment leading a training company, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The young sergeant who had once hidden her scars in shame seemed like a different person now. The transformation hadn't happened overnight and it hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every difficult step. She thought about Johnson and Davis, who had both requested to serve under her command again. Their genuine transformation from bullies to supportive soldiers had been one of the most unexpected outcomes of her ordeal. They had learned that true strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Private Chen had also been accepted to officer candidate school and would be following in her footsteps. His early courage in speaking up had marked him as leadership material, and Sarah had been proud to write his recommendation letter. Sarah's new office overlooked the training grounds where she would soon be responsible for shaping the next generation of military leaders. She understood now that her scars weren't just personal marks. They were teaching tools that could help others understand the real meaning of service and sacrifice. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her mother, calling to congratulate her on the promotion and to tell her how proud the whole family was of her achievements. "Sarah," her mother said, "your father wanted me to tell you something. He said those scars of yours are the most beautiful thing he's ever seen, because they show the world what kind of person his daughter really is." After hanging up, Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the training ground where her own transformation had begun. Tomorrow she would start training new soldiers, helping them understand not just the technical aspects of military service, but the deeper values that made that service meaningful. She touched her scars gently, no longer seeing them as marks of damage but as proof of the person she had chosen to become when tested. They were reminders that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. As the sun set over the base, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez smiled, knowing that her greatest battles had not ended her story, but had prepared her to help write new chapters for the soldiers who would serve under her command. Her scars had become her strength, and her strength would become their inspiration.